It's never a good sign when you start running out of fingers to count the number of ongoing wars. But here we are. The war of the day is between Israel and Iran, with the former making a play on the latter's nuclear program, and, allegedly, a nuclear weapons program. Well, we are now starting to get an idea about the scope of Israel's operation and an assessment of the damage. However, today, I want to explore the broader context of Israel's strategy, both regarding isolated counterproliferation strikes and the bigger picture, a complicated web of war. To get a better outlook, I sat down with Peter Schram, an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University, and an expert not only in gray zone conflict, but also how it can transition into a larger-scale war. I began by asking him about some historical parallels. Peter, Operation Rising Lion, as they are calling it, is an unprecedented attack in some ways, but there have been plenty of previous counterproliferation strikes. Let's focus just on Israel for now. Why don't you start by telling me about some of the other bombing runs that Israel has previously conducted?
In 1981, Israel conducted Operation Opera, which was an airstrike against the nuclear program in Iraq. Additionally, in 2007, Israel conducted Operation Outside the Box, or Operation Orchard. This was a non-disclosed attack against Syria that combined both an airstrike and an electronic weapons attack against Syrian air defenses.
And what these looked like were more traditional interpretations of bombing runs against nuclear programs, right? So I have some planes, my opponent has a nuclear facility, I don't want them to have a nuclear facility, so I get my planes to fly over, bomb those places, and come back, and that's the end of it.
That's exactly right. Of course, Israel isn't the only state that does this kind of thing. If we go back to 1998, the United States conducted Operation Desert Fox against Saddam's nuclear program as well.
Well, that sounds very similar to what we have been seeing in the last 24 hours with Iran and Israel. That being said, this is not the first case of Israel trying to attack Iran's program. We have seen this previously in other iterations, which have not been these large-scale bombing runs. Can you go into some depth there about what we have seen so far previously before the last 24 hours?
The Iranian nuclear program has been of concern to Israel for some time. So going back to 2010, researchers uncovered the Stuxnet computer worm, which was designed by the United States and Israel to disrupt Iranian centrifuges, thus slowing the fuel pipeline that Iran had to its nuclear weapons. Additionally, over 2010 to 2020, roughly 5 Iranian nuclear scientists have been assassinated, it's believed, by Israel.
So clearly, both of those things can cause significant disruptions to Iran's nuclear progress. And I should just state this up front here, that there is a difference in the way that this is publicly described. Iran would say that it has only a nuclear program for civilian use, whereas Western intelligence would tell you that that is a front for Iran trying to develop a nuclear weapon. And I think some of that ties into the Stuxnet virus that you were referring to just a moment ago, where once that got into the system, what it was designed to do was force those centrifuges to spin around very, very quickly. These centrifuges normally try to exploit the slight weight difference between uranium-235 and uranium-238, 238 being the much more common isotope of uranium, but 235 being the isotope that you need to develop a nuclear weapon. The problem for adjudicating the Iranian public position on what its nuclear program was and the Western intelligence assessment is that you can use those centrifuges to enrich uranium to a low degree, so you have a low concentration of 235, for the purposes of doing things like running a nuclear power plant. But if you take those same centrifuges and simply run them for a longer period of time, then you start getting weapons-grade fuel for a nuclear weapon. Now, what that Stuxnet worm did was force the centrifuges to change their speeds, causing them to become unstable and break down. But clearly what we've seen in the last 24 hours is very different from that. Can you go into a little bit of depth about what's going on here and how that is different from what we've seen before with Iran and, as well, previously the other attacks with Syria and Iraq?
The main distinction between this and previous attacks is this is just much more expansive. Previous attacks were very limited. They were airstrikes on a single target, or in the case of Operation Outside the Box, they were conducted with plausible deniability in mind. Israel did not disclose that they had conducted this attack and gave Syria the opportunity to essentially not talk about it. Same for Stuxnet computer worm, this was done to be covert. If we look at the attacks that are happening in Iran now, there's no plausible deniability here. These are attacks on hundreds of targets rather than just a single site, as well as multiple assassinations of senior leadership and Iranian nuclear scientists. The scope is just well beyond anything we've seen before that Israel's conducted against other nuclear programs.
So, summarizing here, what we've seen in the last 24 hours between Israel and Iran is starting to feel like a full-scale war. We're not quite there yet, but it looks like this could be something that we're going to be seeing for multiple days or potentially weeks, which again is very different from the types of actions that you were describing just a moment ago. And I know that we, and I'm using we very broadly here to mean we people on the internet, the media, sometimes researchers like you and me, sometimes myself when I'm on a YouTube video. When we talk about war, we tend to talk about it as a binary choice. You're either at war or you're not at war. But clearly, countries have a menu of options to choose from, and some of those things fall in between what we would traditionally think of as pure peace and pure war. Sometimes you hear about this being described as hybrid warfare or gray zone conflict, or in your personal research, hassling. Can you talk a little bit about what this has looked like historically, both with those examples previously of counter-proliferation strategies, as well as perhaps a little bit more broadly?
For context, there's this whole range of activities that states do to one another that isn't war, but also isn't quite peace. So think about Operation Outside the Box against Syria. We wouldn't call something like that war, but we also wouldn't say that that's a peaceful act. If we think about the various actions that happen in international politics, there's lots of things that fall between the space of war and peace that states are doing to each other pretty much all the time. These things include actions like cyber warfare, or China building or occupying islands in the South and East China Sea, or Iran offering support to Hamas or Hezbollah. There's a bunch of other modern examples of this as well going on. But it's important to note that none of this is particularly new. The Cold War was full of activities, like the United States supporting insurgent groups in Latin America. But also, United States was founded as part of a third-party backed insurgency. And if we go back to the era of state-sponsored piracy, that's its own kind of form of gray zone conflict.
Well, building on that, I think some listeners might find this little tidbit interesting. The reason that we're talking today is actually not necessarily specifically because Iran and Israel are getting involved in a conflict. We had scheduled this weeks before because we were planning on talking about the evolution of the conflict in Ukraine, going from the 2014 to 2022 shadow war to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February of 2022.
Quite the bait and switch, Will.
Don't blame me, blame the current state of international relations. Well, I would love to have another opportunity to talk to you about that in the future. It does raise the question about the parallel between what that question would have been to the current question for today involving Israel and Iran. Clearly, we have seen a transition in Israel's strategy here, where for years it was interested in doing these sorts of hassling or gray zone operations. But today, we are seeing something very different. Again, it feels like it could be the start of a full-scale war. So my question for you is, what causes that sort of transition? Why is it that you might start with one sort of step, these smaller scale conflicts, before escalating to something larger? And I know it's tempting to say, well, you start small and grow larger as you go, but there's more nuance to it than that, right?
Once we start thinking about international actions as being on a continuum, we can start thinking about states choosing to switch between those actions. How these policies are implemented is done in one way, but then once it meets the real world, there can be uncertainty over how these policies actually play out. It could be the case that Israel is implementing they started by doing softer policies against Iran and is now going much harder with these current strikes. But it could also be the case that Israel viewed its initial policies against Iran as not as effective as it could be to meet the moment. And so they're shifting to increase their pressure on the regime. Reporting suggests that Iran is closer to a nuclear weapon than they've ever been before, which might suggest that the policies that Israel chose in the past, things like Stuxnet or these limited airstrikes, may not have been enough to meet the moment.
I suppose that gets at a question that a lot of policymakers are going to have in the future, as well as historians and political scientists, which is that the type of operation that Israel has to conduct today is much more expansive, as we were talking about at the beginning, than the types of operations that Israel had to conduct against, say, Iraq or against Syria. So with Syria and Iraq, both of these were small-scale reactors that would be many steps away from being able to develop a nuclear weapon. Because to develop a nuclear weapon, you have to fuel the thing, and to fuel it, that means you either have to enrich uranium, which means running centrifuges, which is not what this was, or running a nuclear reactor, which this kind of was, but again, small-scale, to eventually extract plutonium through a separate process known as reprocessing. In both of those cases, Israel took a very direct approach to destroy that by sending bombers to those areas and bombing them so that they would no longer be functional. That is a smaller scale operation than what we're seeing today because, well, Iran has a lot more facilities to strike. But unlike the earlier strategies that Israel pursued with Iran, Israel went with a kinetic response to Iraq and Syria. So putting all of this together, the question that remains is why did Israel choose to pursue these small-scale, gray zone, hassling-style operations against Iran initially, before eventually escalating to a kinetic response, which again, unlike Syria and Iraq, were not simple sorts of actions that were trying to nip a problem in the bud. The time that Israel gave Iran through the hassling operations meant that Iran was able to expand its operations, which is now forcing Israel, if Israel chooses to do so, which again, they are right now, Israel has to go deeply into Iran and attack a lot of things. So do we have any plausible ideas why Israel pursued initially the smaller scale operations versus Iran, as compared to taking something that was higher up on the ladder of escalation with Iraq and Syria?
That's a great question. There's likely a number of factors that are in play here. It's a lot harder to strike Iran than, for example, Syria, which was Israel's neighbor. And that distance would also mean it's easier for Iran to track Israeli jets moving towards its airspace. Additionally, Iran learned from the Iraq case to have multiple nuclear reactors, thus making it a harder program to take out in a single airstrike. Additionally, there's reporting that the United States collaborated with Israel on the Stuxnet computer worm, thus suggesting that Israel's closest ally had buy-in for these limited forms of gray zone conflict against the Iranian nuclear program. All this likely made that the more appealing way to go for Iran.
So this is the type of situation where there's no half measures, it's just quarter measures or full measures?
Yeah, this is just hard to say. This is all so new, and there's uncertainty about how these policies are playing out within Iran and the actual effect that they're having on the Iranian nuclear program. But I also want to have some pause. I wouldn't say that what Israel is doing right now is a full-scale response. We're not seeing Israeli troops on the ground, which would constitute a new and more dramatic scale of escalation.
Well, another angle to think about the escalation choices that we haven't yet discussed is the broader political picture of the world at war currently. You have a war going on, of course, inside of Ukraine. You have Israel involved in its own war along the Gaza Strip. You have increased tensions in the Indo-Pacific. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on here that's relatively new as compared to the decade plus of time that Israel had been engaged in these hassling measures. Another big part of the picture is the Trump administration's negotiations with Iran, which, as of yesterday, were ongoing, trying to reach some sort of deal with Iran to lower the amount of uranium enrichment that Iran might have, or have other measures be put into place that would limit Iran's ability to develop a nuclear weapon. So, do you see any sort of connections there in what Israel might be thinking with its strategy in the broader context of the broader world at war?
Yeah, so there's three ways of really looking at this. First is that Israel is doing this to disrupt the Iranian nuclear program by bombing these reactors Israel is pushing back the clock, that Iran needs to develop nuclear weapons. Another interpretation of this is that Israel may be doing this to help the United States secure a better bargaining position for the negotiations between Tehran and Washington. Third, and this is the most complicated, is Israel doesn't know how Iran will respond to this, but it very well could be the case that Iran responds in such a way that the United States will offer support to Israel in its continued operations against Iran moving forward. For example, if Iran supercharges its support for the Houthis in attacking shipping lanes, then the United States might implement a response to the Houthis, which Israel really wanted in the first place. I think we can say that if Israel was projecting forward what these current actions in Iran will mean for the greater region, Israel believed that there's a number of outcomes that could happen that would all be more beneficial than conducting these more limited or covert strikes against Iranian actions. So I think that's what's really changed here and provoked this more dramatic escalation by Israel.
Well, I think all of this is touching on one of the central themes that I have had in the course of the last few years, which is that it is very difficult for anyone on the outside in international relations to be able to understand exactly what is motivating countries to take particular actions, never mind try to predict where a war is going to go or even if a war is going to start. And I think that is a good place to wrap up for today. So thank you for joining me today, Peter.
Thank you, Will. Always a pleasure seeing you.
And if you enjoyed this interview, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.